March 31st. So this year our ADM is actually 123 students lower than the state originally forecasted when they first developed the revenue projections. When you look at our other revenue categories, our federal revenue came in higher than was projected. Some of that is Title I funding that was from the prior fiscal year that was received in this fiscal year. So we had pointed that out at our last year's final budget review. We were short that revenue and said it would come in this year, and I'm pleased to say that it did. When we look at our other revenue, the other kind of bright spot in one sense is our other revenue came in higher than we projected, and it's due in large part to stop arm camera violation revenue. Right, that revenue is obviously revenue that we're receiving when people are passing a stop arm on the bus, which is not a good sign. But the good sign that we presented in our operational update last month is we really don't see people having repeat violations of that revenue. So this year, that vendor did update all of the equipment on our buses and added some on to ensure that every bus had that stop arm camera. So that revenue was $141,500, which helped in terms of the overall revenue category. So when we look at expenditures for the school operating fund totaled $50.6 million. And after we account for encumbrances, and encumbrances are orders that we placed prior to June 30th, but we have invoices that are not yet paid. So you can see we currently still have $45,374 in unpaid invoices remaining. But after we account for that, our expenditures were $673,870 lower than budgeted. And most of that variance is coming from our salaries and benefit accounts. So when you look at those variances, in total this year, our overall expenditures were 1.3% lower than budgeted. So when we look at salaries, our salaries were 1.1 lower than budgeted. That's significantly less than the 3.1% variance that we had in those accounts in fiscal year 18. And then benefits had a variance of 2.4%, which was also lower than our 3.7% variance in 2018. So I just wanted to remind the public and anyone listening, if you remember, we had made changes when we budgeted our FY19 budget, this budget, where we used actual salaries that we had taken later in the year in terms of developing that budget. And then in our FY20 budget, in addition to using that salary methodology, we also have started budgeting for what's called lapse. Right, savings that occurs during the turnover. So we're anticipating this is going to get even tighter as we move forward. But we're pleased that these are headed in the right direction in terms of that expenditure variances. In the other categories, when you look, you can see contracted services were underspent by 11.7%, while at the same time utilities, insurance, travel, and rental are overspent. So those really kind of offset each other. Our variance in materials and supplies was small at 1.6%. And then in the last category, you'll see expenditures for capital and capital replacements exceeded the budget by $449,580. That was expected. We had intended that because that included the approved expenditures from last year's fiscal year end for Mount Daniel. So that was the additional funding in place for those improvements. So again, those are exactly what we expected. So that variance reflects exactly what the board approved last year. So overall, when we look at this chart, shows our actual revenue for 2019 in the column to the left, our actual expenditures underneath that, and then you see that impact to our ending balance. So for FY19, our ending balance decreased by $135,724. When you compare that to the actual expenditures from last year end, you can see last year we actually added to our ending balance. So we've really made a significant improvement in terms of budgeting much tighter. And then the chart at the bottom shows a multi-year fund balance history, so it goes all the way back to 2013. And you can see our fund balance over time. In 2013, it was $2.3 million. Then it decreased and it has grown, but again, we're now starting to shrink that fund balance. And we will be coming back to the board with ways that we think we can spend fund balance to address some needs. So when we look at the food service fund, in our food service fund, revenues totaled $801,000 for FY19. And that was $301,928 less than we had budgeted. And revenues were actually $328 lower than the prior year. So when we look at the variance between our actuals and our budget, they're primarily due to food sales. In the last 2 years, in both of those cases, our budget for food sales was actually higher, and we've probably been kind of consistently over budgeting. But when we look at food sales, it also impacts the revenue that we receive from the federal school lunch program. So in this year-end budget report, I've included a chart that really looks at cafeteria sales for breakfast and lunch for each of the different school sites, and then has a total for each year. So you can see in FY19, those total sales were $679,000, and in the prior year, they were $671,000. So you can see overall, our breakfast and lunch sales went up 1.2%. So we had a small increase at Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School. We had that substantial increase at Mount Daniel as you look at food service coming back online with our new cafeteria being open. At Thomas Jefferson, we did have a decrease of 11%. At the high school, sales were basically flat. And then we did see a decrease at JTP. JTP, I would remind everyone listening, does have a small school population, so sales are impacted by the makeup of the students in that building. So when we look at food service for next year, we really are working to improve our overall lunch sales, and we'll continue to try to improve our revenue there. Our expenditures are really tied to revenue, so when you look at our actual revenue and expenditures for the food service fund, for FY19, our actual impact to ending balance was a decrease of $64,528. So very similar to how we ended the prior year. So in both cases, our expenditures exceeded our revenue. When you look at the food service fund overall, they still have an ending balance at the end of this fiscal year of $274,430. So we have a planned use of fund balance in our next year's budget of $100,000. So again, when you look at both 18 and 19, we had budgeted to use $100,000 in fund balance. In each of those years, we used less. Right, so when we look, we still are in a very healthy place as we move into FY20, and then we are very excited about the new food service operations at the new high school and combining that kitchen between the middle and high school. So the last fund that I wanted to talk about was our Community Services Fund. Community Services Fund includes both our extended daycare program and our community use program. So when you look at that fund, overall, our fund balance decreased by $316,444. And again, this was the expected decrease in fund balance due to the daycare program replacing the playgrounds at both Thomas Jefferson and Mount Daniel. They funded both of those programs, and that work was completed over the summer. So you'll see that in the expenditures as I walk through this fund as well. When you look at revenue for community services, it totaled $1.9 million for FY19. That was $555,528 less than budgeted. And when for the Community Services Fund, for both the daycare program and community use, our expenditures are directly tied to the revenue that we bring in. So all of the staffing is hired and utilized based on how much revenue we're generating for that fund. So when we look at that fund as a whole, you can see our total fees. Daycare brought in FY19 $1,277,050 in fees, and our community use fees were $314,119. So our total revenue in that fund was $1,591,169. So overall, when we look at the fund balance for our daycare fund, again, that fund balance did decrease for FY19 by $316,444, but that was due to the planned replacement of those playgrounds that the daycare board had approved as well. So overall, following all of this information, we have detailed revenue and expenditure charts for each fund that show the revenue and expenditure by each object. And those charts include what the revised budget was, the year-to-date actual, which was through September 8th, any encumbrances, and what the available budget was in each of those categories. So thank you for the opportunity to present this information, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Any questions from the board?
Actually, not a question, just it's very nice to get such a clear presentation and a report. So thank you very much for all your hard work. This was clear, simple to understand, and well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me echo Mr. Reidinger. This was very nicely done and very nicely presented and very clear. So thank you for that. I did have a couple of questions. One is, you were talking about the lower than expected revenue from the state and then tied to the attendance information. Are we expecting potentially that to go back up a little bit now that we're actually maybe a little higher than they were projecting? What are you thinking on that one?
So yes, when we look at our enrollment now, one of the great things is looking at our enrollment being above projection, then we should see a small increase in state aid overall. Also, in addition to that, we are going to receive that technology grant funding in this year as well. So we'll have both the benefit of higher enrollment and that state technology grant funding.
Thanks. And then the only other question I guess I have is, for the food service, the large change, mostly at TJ, I'm thinking about. Any idea what's driving that change?
I don't. I will be working with Richard to really go through and look at if we can pinpoint if there are specific days, if that has to do with the lunch scheduling, the menus. One of the things that we find is when we don't have students participating in lunch at the earliest elementary level, they start the process of packing a lunch, and then as they move on, they continue to pack a lunch, right? So some of that might be the students that were at Mount Daniel and didn't have that opportunity to eat in the cafeteria. But we'll continue to look at those trends and really try to do a better analysis of what's happening on a more timely basis than waiting until the year's over.
Thanks. Thanks again.
Ms. Russell?
I was just going to offer up, Kristen, that one thing that I've heard is that when the lunch line is exceptionally long, then kids tend not to buy. So I'm just wondering if the decrease in kids at TJ is probably going to help that in terms of the waiting time. I don't know how that's going to, if it's going to flip over at Mount Daniel, but I think that they have a more, I guess, up-to-date setup in terms of. So I would expect that even, when we move to Mason and we have the more streamlined process, that probably, we'll also see a jump in sales just based on how the lines are set up.
I completely agree. And when you look at even this last week at Mason, right, I know the lunch lines were long, so we're really looking forward to that scramble serving, where not only will kids not have to wait in line for their items, but they'll be able to go to the different serving places and then check out in one place. So I completely agree, and that's something we're really looking forward to.
Yeah, Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I realized I had one other question, which was brought up by the fund balance over time. You were talking about reducing sort of the remaining fund balance by using it for some specific purposes. I'm wondering what you would be recommending as kind of a baseline target to have as a fund balance year to year as a percentage basis, for example?
So when you look at fund balance overall, right, many people recommend having quite a large fund balance. So when you look at GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, for example, they really recommend that you have 3 months worth of operating expenditures in an ending balance. But because such a large portion of our revenue is coming from our local government and that revenue is stable, right, that recommendation doesn't really make sense. If we were completely reliant on revenue that was generated from, property tax or other means, right? Having a larger contingency might be more beneficial. I think in general, we've been building our budget with that beginning balance or use of fund balance of $450,000. So we certainly want to at least maintain that because if we don't have that, I think we're probably cutting it close. So we're probably close to the target we should be at, but I think we just want to watch it because it's something where we don't want to save money that we have immediate needs for that we could address.
Great. Any other questions or comments from the board? Mr. Castillo?
So just a kind of related question to what Mr. Anderson asked. So why don't we just make the fund balance go away at the end of every year, just spend the whole thing?
So what I found is if you have where you should just spend your entire fund balance, what happens is you make expenditures because you have money available and you spend the money on what's in front of you, but it's not always your highest priority and your biggest need, right? Versus if you're hanging on to money and you can strategically use it, you have the ability to address true needs and also to really help smooth things out over a multi-year process. So spending everything that you have really does result in less efficient expenditures and it doesn't achieve your long-term outcomes nearly as well.
Okay, but right now, as we go into the next budget cycle, why couldn't we take this fund balance and just devote all that to building the budget?
So fund balance is one-time money that's available from a prior fiscal year, and we can't commit one-time funding to a recurring expenditure. So if we look at this money in our fund balance and say, okay, we want to use that fund